Everyone, welcome to Group 2 discussion, and we are going to be discussing about the written sources. Welcome.
Written sources of history are the sources of history which are in the form of written text. Written sources are under the category of literary sources. Written sources may be an ancient, medieval, and modern history. Biographies, autobiographies, letters, newspapers, journals, periodicals, magazines, official documents, and reference books are an examples of written sources of history. Oral sources are the sources of history that provide spoken account of the past historical events. Oral source is a collection and provides various studies of past historical events about the individuals, families, important events, and everyday life by using sound recording, videotapes, and audio tapes, etc. Folk songs, gatha, shlokas, abhangas, povadas, proverbs, legends, and myths are an examples of oral sources of history.
Hello, I'm Nathan Kipchirchir. I'll be taking you through the definition of the word written records. These are the resources which are available in the textual form.
Hello, my viewer. I am Dennis Kipkoech, and I'm going to take you through the primary sources. And we can say that primary sources are materials that roughly come from the time in which the historian has chosen to examine. I will be taking you through the examples of primary sources. This includes personal channels, we have ads, newspapers, magazines, books, and finally we have digitalized collection from internet.
Hello, I'm Naiga Mogoi. We are going to look at the secondary sources. They are also referred to as historiography. These sources are books and articles. Articles are produced by historians and they are the most common types of written sources. These are the final working produced by an historian. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Erickson Chalana. They are pieces of historical writings that are anchored in primary sources. The works in these sources are not simply chronologies of historical evidence such as names, dates, places, and events. They are arguments or interpretations about the past that emerge from an immersion in and are built upon a foundation of historical evidence such as primary sources. Historians draw on secondary sources by either quoting or paraphrasing in order to support certain claims or to challenge work done by other historians.
This is the Australian National University Library.
And this video will explain the difference between primary, secondary, and tertiary sources. Most research uses primary, secondary, and tertiary sources. They complement each other and help to build a convincing argument. Primary sources are typically considered more credible in terms of evidence, but secondary and tertiary sources show how your work relates to existing research. Let's break down the differences, starting with primary sources. This is ground-level, first-hand evidence for any discipline. Marie Curie's lab notebook is an excellent example of a primary source, but it literally cannot be handled as it is still massively radioactive. Sources that provide a first-hand account of an event or a time period are typically primary. In science, this is often the first time an experiment is conducted, but primary sources don't have to be scientific. In history, this can be a journal from a soldier in the First World War. Primary source material can also represent original thinking, reports on discoveries and events, or they may share new information. And finally, they are considered to be authoritative. For the most part, I'll get to that in a minute. The next is secondary sources. This is any material created using primary sources. Secondary source material provide analysis, interpretation, or a restatement of primary sources. Newspaper articles and some textbooks are examples of secondary sources. While primary sources are considered authoritative, secondary sources are considered to be persuasive. Unfortunately, what constitutes a primary or a secondary source is not absolute. It depends on the information it contains, how you are going to use it, and the discipline you are studying. We will talk about this more in a minute. Finally, tertiary sources. These are similar to secondary sources in that they include both primary and secondary sources. But the difference is that they do not present any new information, nor do they offer an analysis of information sources. Examples of tertiary source material could include some textbooks, abstracts, and most reference works like dictionaries, bibliographies, and encyclopedias. Even, shock horror, Wikipedia. Now, primary, secondary, and tertiary sources can look different depending on your discipline. In arts and social sciences, a primary source could be a painting by Indigenous Australian artist Rover Thomas. A secondary source could be a book about Rover Thomas and his work. A tertiary source could be an encyclopedia entry about either Rover Thomas or referencing the book written about him. In science, a primary source could be the 2012 paper Supernovae, the Accelerating Cosmos and Dark Energy by Brian Schmidt and Thierry Monmel. A secondary source could be an article discussing this research, while a tertiary source could consist of an abstract that describes the paper's findings but provides no additional analysis. Tertiary sources do not analyze the sources to create new information, and that is a key difference. Then there is the difficult question, can a source be more than one type? The answer is yes, but annoyingly this can be different depending on your individual context. Consider a speech or even a tweet by a prominent political figure. You could consider this a secondary source, right? Yes, it is persuasive and, let's be honest, not always brimming with facts, but the speech itself happened as a moment in history, making it a primary source in that context. So, yes, a source can be primary in one context and secondary in another, or a source can be both secondary and tertiary. But should you quote the Prime Minister's tweet as scientific fact? Probably best not to. It can be used as a primary source in politics, history, or advertising, depending on how it is framed. Here are 3 examples of those grey areas, where a source can be different depending on the context. Documentaries. When you are researching the causes of World War II, a recent documentary about the war is considered a secondary source. But if you are researching the filmmaking techniques used in historical documentaries, then the documentary itself is a primary source. Reviews and essays. If your paper is about the novels of Anita Heiss, a magazine review of one of her novels is a secondary source. But if your paper is about the critical reception of Anita Heiss's work, then the review is actually a primary source itself. Then there are newspaper articles. If your aim is to analyse a government's economic policy, a newspaper article about a new policy is a secondary source. But if your aim is to analyse media coverage of economic issues, the newspaper article is a primary source. So, remember, whether you directly quote, paraphrase, or synthesize a primary, secondary, or tertiary source, make sure you cite it to avoid plagiarism.
If you're still in doubt, it's always best to check with your lecturer or supervisor. And don't forget, the ANU Library is here to help. We have an amazing collection of online materials and loads of guides available to support you. Just click the subscribe button so you never miss a video. Having trouble or need some specific assistance? If in doubt, just reach out. You can always contact the ANU Library for support. We're here to help.
Everyone, I'm Naibei Susan and I'll be taking you to tertiary sources. Books and articles deals exclusively on secondary sources. On the research of others, tertiary sources are usually synthetic in nature. They pull together a number of separate but related accounts of events, issues, and body of scholars.
We will have a short video that will give us information about tertiary sources.
Howdy, my name is Laura Ray with the Texas A&M University Medical Sciences Library. I'm going to talk about what tertiary sources are and some ways you can tell the differences. Tertiary sources are typically textbooks, handbooks, or reference books that provide foundational information. These might also be classified as secondary sources. Tertiary sources can be great sources. They may not necessarily be appropriate for your assignment. Check with your instructor to determine what sources are acceptable for their writing assignment. As examples of tertiary resources, this is an electronic textbook, which is also available in print. Chapters from tertiary sources can have multiple authors, descriptive headings and text, figures, images, and references. This is an example of a handbook shown in an electronic format. The main thing to remember is tertiary sources are intended to provide an overview of a topic, which textbooks, handbooks, reference books, and fact sheets do well. This is an example of a reference book in electronic format. This is an example of a fact sheet in electronic format. In addition to tertiary resources, some websites may be a great source of secondary or even primary information. This is another example of a fact sheet. The way these are formatted can be confusing because they can look similar to articles.
Hello guys, I'm Yvonne Aliaka. I'm here to give you some advantages of written sources. 1. It is a permanent record that can be kept from generation to generations. 2. Most important dates are recorded. 3. Information cannot be changed because it is written down.
Hi everyone, I'm Nyabuto Edwin, taking you through the advantages of written sources. So we start. Information can reach many people through reading, and next it can be safely kept in archives.
Hi everyone, I'm Ogoya Sharon, ready to take you through disadvantages of written sources. Written sources may contain biases and distortions. They are limited to only literate persons. Some of them contain inaccurate information. They are expensive. Information may be misinterpreted by the reader.
Now we have come to the end of the session. I hope you have understood the written sources.